Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to MIT App Inventor. Today we're going to be talking about APIs and just what an API is and being able to look at some specific examples. So without much further ado, let's get started. Now for a second, I want you to imagine that there's just a server somewhere in the internet. Now this server could contain lots of different data on it. Maybe it contains like chart data that you want to chart. So maybe it has something like stock data. Or maybe it contains weather data. It could contain the temperature. Maybe it contains map information that you need. Or maybe it contains like personal information like a calendar that you're keeping track of or something along those lines. Now, the thing we're trying to do here though is if we have a phone or another website we're on and we want to actually take this data from a web server that's somewhere else and actually put it on our phone. Now, this is seemingly simple in concept. We just simply go to the server. But what if we don't want to actually go to this website and grab that data by hand? We don't want to view it on there. We want to just take it from here and place it on our app, right? So if we just instead replace it, right? Say maybe we're doing this chart. Now that's the question here. So how do we do that? How do we do that so that it's easy and consistent and quick? Now the answer to that question is APIs. Now, an API is going to be able to consistently grab data from the server and send it in a standard way. If you want to think about it in a similar way, if you think about your electrical socket in your house, if you plug something into your electrical socket there, you can go over to your friend's house next door and you can plug that same plug you have into that electrical socket. That's because it is a standard outlet, right? So there's some form of a standard that we can use to get power from all houses in the United States. Now, APIs are similar. If we contact an API, it's going to be able to access the server in a way that we expect and be able to we can send a specific type of request and get a specific type of response, no matter what server or API we are talking to. So that means we're going to be able to send a request from one place to the next to the server, and it's going to actually request that information in a consistent manner and send it back in a consistent manner so we can actually use it. So for example, the standard is going to be using something called HTTP. Now, you may have seen this at the beginning of the links that you type in all the time. It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and that's just basically the rules of the internet. So if we wanted to get information from the server, it's really easy. We use the HTTP GET method. Now that's going to request a specific type of information. Maybe if we were going to grab temperature data, it's going to then send that data through the API, right? We're contacting this API, and the API is allowing us to talk to this server and then get information from that server and then send it back in JSON or XML code, which is going to make our lives way easier, and then we can change our data and change our app. Now, that's really big, broad overview. We're going to be looking at specific examples today on how this actually works. So let's talk a little bit more about why we use APIs and what APIs do. So if we think about this, API stands for Application Programmer Interface. Now that means it's basically that in-between, if we go back to this drawing, it's the in-between between a server and an app, or an app and an app, right? So the API is an interface, right? You notice there's things going through it and in both directions. So it's interfacing between the server and an app, or machine-to-machine interfacing. So if we want to think about it, APIs are a standard that allows information to be sent from one machine to another. And again, just to kind of reiterate this idea of a standard. So other examples of standards that we have are electrical sockets in the US, or, for example, the metric standard. If you were going to be measuring in, length of expo markers and centimeters, that's going to be kind of a weird way if you're trying to talk to somebody about how tall the Eiffel Tower is, and you say, it's about 1,000 expo markers, and then the other person says it's about 300 meters. You guys are going to have a very different idea of what you're talking about. So again, it's just a way for us to make our communication much easier and quicker. So for example, if I were to send information from my laptop to an app, and I didn't know what this information was, then it would be a little confusing. So if we did that, instead if we have a standard communication, we can be able to communicate and translate this information every time we receive it and build a program that does that for us. And now we're not so confused anymore, we're a little happy. So that's going to make our life a lot easier. So let's take another look more closely at the actual process that's going into the API. Now, the way that it works is first we're going to have an API HTTP request, then we're going to get an API JSON response, and then we're going to have to parse that JSON in order to get the information that we want. So if we take another zoom in on each of these, the API HTTP request is actually going to be the get method, which makes sense. We're getting information from the API. So all that does is it requests data from the URL of the API. So that URL is going to be the location of the API that we are interfacing with that then is going to communicate to the server. We're then going to be getting an API JSON response, which is just a specific type of code, and we'll take another closer look at JSON code here in just a second, but it's just going to pull that requested data and then send it to us so that we can then parse it. And all we are doing when we're parsing JSON code is it's broken down, we get a bunch of information from the server, and we just want to break it down to get one piece of information. So let's take a look at some request examples in terms of like the API request and what the URL might look like. So if we look at a weather API request, we see that in MIT App Inventor, we're actually going to be, when we click on Get Weather, we're going to set our URL of the web component to these, a combination of these three things. First part is the actual location of the API. Notice it says api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather ? Q equals. So what we're asking here is, what is the weather at the location of what we entered, cityname.txt. So whatever we entered here would then be what we're querying. And then the third thing we have here is the key of the API. Now, all APIs or most APIs have a key, which is just to verify that you're not, using this for free and using it on some business that you're using. If you're going to be using it a million times and taking up all their API requests, obviously you're probably going to have to pay for that. So this is what the URL would look like. It'd be HTTP plus, it'd be all of this plus this plus this. So it's a pretty long URL, but that's how we actually request a specific piece of information from an API. And then we just say, this is where we have the HTTP request, the HTTP get method. We just say call web1.get, and now we're getting information from this API. If we look at another example, we can look at a recipe API request, and this one's a little different. So now we're setting the URL to join, and we're saying http food2fork.com/API/get ? So we're going to be getting something here, and we're saying the key, again, instead of it says app ID here, it says key here, so it's a little different. Same idea though, this is our key that we're using as basically our identifier to the API. And then it's going to say, and our ID. Now, all that means is the recipe ID number is going to be equal to, so this is the recipe ID here. So again, this URL is going to be all of this combined into one. And then we're going to be calling web1.get. This is the HTTP request we're sending here to this URL that we made up here. Okay, so it's kind of weird, but and you kind of have to play around with this. You might have to ask me some questions about this. Each API is a little different, and you might need to be changing this URL a little bit depending on what you're requesting. But that's the basic gist of an API request. Again, all you're doing is you make a URL, and then you use the web1 or the web component get, which is the HTTP get method, and you're actually getting all the information from that API. The problem is it's going to send it in JSON. It's going to send a bunch of information. And JSON is kind of a little goofy. So we're actually going to have to parse that information. But before we do that, let's take a look at JSON code. So if we look here, the basic syntax is that all the data in JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it'll make sense why it's called that in a second, but all the data is in name value pairs. And we're going to look at an example here in just a second. Second, data is separated by commas. Third, curly braces hold objects, or curly brackets, either way, you can call them either way. They hold objects. Notice it's JavaScript Object Notation, so those are individual objects within the JSON code. And then square brackets hold arrays, so that would be multiple things. So let's take a look at an example here. So notice I color coordinated things, so chord, probably stands for coordinates, is an object that holds two different name value pairs, the longitude and the latitude. So this right here, lon, and all of this, including the quotes and the colon, is the name. The value is in red, which is just the number associated with it. So we have two name value pairs inside of this object chord. Now, weather is actually an array, and it's holding, in this case, 4 different name value pairs. So we have ID, which is just one name, and it's the value. It's probably the ID of the weather. It's going to be main. The main is clouds. The description is broken clouds. And maybe you could use this. I know some of you were thinking about making a weather app. You could probably use this to break down. If you found the description, you could actually have a graphic for broken clouds or whatever the descriptions there are, which is pretty awesome. So again, data is in name value pairs, like longitude and then its value. It's separated by commas. Notice there's commas between each of these. And then curly braces, or curly brackets, hold objects. So we have an object here, which is a coordinate. Notice so the coordinate, really objects come in varied things, but this is one example of an object. And then square brackets hold arrays, which are lists of individual objects or items, which is pretty awesome. So let's take a really quick look at, I have an example here on the next slide of the process that we go through to break down a JSON response. So if we were actually, this is an actual JSON response from a Google Books API. Now, we looked up a specific book and we want to grab just the name of the book. So the title right here. So, sorry about that. So we just want to grab the title. So if I grab my highlighter here, let's see if I can grab it. We just want to grab, where is it? The title. And we don't want this part, we just want this here. Now, we have all of this other stuff that's going to be sent to the app as well. So what we're going to have to do is we're actually going to have to parse this out. And what that means is we're going to have to just take the information we want and leave everything else behind. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to split it at the start tag, which in this case, let me change my color here, is this title here. So this is our start tag right here. So we're going to split it right here. And we're going to take everything after that. So now we have just everything after that. And that's what we're left with. Now, we still just want this, right? So then what we're going to do is we're going to split it at the end tag. And the end tag in this case is just the comma, which is right here, right? So we're going to split it right here, and we're going to split everything off after that. So then we're just left with this. Right here, the title. Now, we probably don't want the quotes and the comma and everything, so what we're going to do is we're going to decode the JSON and HTML code and then return just our final result, which is what we've been wanting this whole time, which is this guy right here. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a look at some more specific examples in the next video where I actually go over how I did this in MIT App Inventor. But this is the big general idea. Again, we're getting a JSON response from the API based off of what we requested, and then we're going to have to parse it out. So when we look at the examples, I'm going to be doing 3 examples here. So the first example will be the weather app. So weather. A second here. So the weather app. Number 2 will be I'll do a recipe app. And then I might do a third one for either books or a clock API, just to show you guys some examples. So that's going to be the next video that I'm going to make here. But this is the general idea that all APIs use. Now, in this next video, we're going to look at some specific examples, but the same ideas hold true. So look for that next video. It's going to be pretty cool, and I'm just going to go over some examples of, again, more parsing and more URL generation. Okay? Thank you. Happy programming.